Thank you, Hissam. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here in the presence especially of His Excellency the Minister of Water and also the former Minister of Water, Dr. Abu Zaid. I think this is going to be a very interesting session, and I'm very happy to be part of it. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate. As Dr. Hissam mentioned, we have done this kind of work in many different places in the world. I like to be involved in large river basins because they are the ones that have the greatest impacts and benefits, but also issues associated with them. And certainly the Nile has its own fair share of these things. But I wanted to, so we have been involved with the Nile Basin for a while now, almost 30 years. And we have developed various tools. And so I'll focus really on the Nile Basin in this presentation. It's okay? Yeah, thank you. There was a Greek geographer long ago who called Egypt the gift of the Nile. It was Herodotus, and he was a geographer and a historian. If he were in the audience today, I think I would tell him that he could have been a very good water resources engineer, because his focus was not about sharing water, but sharing the gifts of water. And that's really the reality and the core of sustainable river basin management. That's really my overarching message. So our involvement with the Nile goes back a long time, 30 years I would say, and we have developed various tools to support and inform and develop knowledge and information that the Nile Basin countries and people can use to arrive at equitable and sustainable solutions to the ways that they can share the gifts of the Nile. And those tools have go back to, like I said, 30 years. Some of them involve all of the countries of the Nile. That was the Nile DST that we developed long ago, and we had the privilege to work with all of the Nile countries. We did a lot of training on decision support systems and forecasting and the typical hydrologic and water resources management issues. That was a great experience. I enjoyed it immensely, the tool has been used in various ways from all the Nile people to examine trade-offs, to explore possible compromising solutions and things of that sort. But there were other involvement we have had, not only planning models, which is the Eastern Nile DSS that I'm going to talk about today and the studies associated with it, but also operational issues. For example, how to operate Lake Victoria and the two power plants that are there, Nalubali and Kira, by Uganda, is something that we have developed software for. So it actually operates the system, forecasts the flows, and schedules the turbines that they have there to produce power, but also to optimize water management objectives. The same thing here in Egypt with the High Aswan Dam DSS, which is operated in the Nile Forecast Center for many years. So, but today I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about the Eastern Nile Planning DSS that we developed specifically for the Eastern Nile River to try to look into these issues of the implications of the GRD and the coordination that it might have with the other existing projects. So let me go through some technical details first to tell you what the model is all about, so that you have a good feel that this effort is not just it's an effort that took us a long time to figure out. We used a lot of data, a lot of information, a lot of knowledge we had over the years, especially knowledge that was gained by working together with the people here in the Nile Basin, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. So this is the system that I'm going to talk to you about, and it's, like I said, it includes the Blue Nile, it includes the White Nile, but from Gebel Aulia, from Mogren up to the Mediterranean, Atbara, and of course the main Nile River. And these are the projects that we have included in it so that we can play different scenarios of what-if management type of questions. Of course, it includes the GRD at different levels of capacities and filling rules and regulation strategies, as I will talk to you about. It includes the Osiris, Senar, and the Kazmel Jirba on Atbara, as well as Meroe, as well as, of course, the High Aswan Dam and the Old Aswan Dam together, because it's a complex that has to be operated for power production purposes in coordination. So that's a system that this particular modeling system actually includes. These are the data that we have used. I'm going through this because in all the studies, in all the transboundary issues that I have been involved, it's important that we talk about the data, we agree on the data, we agree on the models, and the validity or the potential reliability that they have, and then move on to studies. If we don't do that, we need to do this homework. We need to do this because otherwise later on issues can arise on the basis that perhaps the models are, they actually have certain things that may not be appropriate. But we've done our best, given the experience we've had and the information we've received from all the countries, to try to reconstruct and to have a continuous series that we are going to base the assessments for, from 1912 to 2011. So that's 100 years of data, historical data, okay? And I show you here how some of this information was pieced together for the different parts of that system. So the White Nile, the Blue Nile, Dinder and Rahad, as well as the Atbara flows. I can talk more about it, of course, but one thing I want to say is that the average Nile yield at Mogren, which is at the exit of Gebel Aulia, is about 26 billion cubic meters per year. That's the units I'm going to use in this presentation. The Blue Nile at border, at the station where the GRD is being built essentially, is 51.5, just to give you a feel of the relative magnitudes. So 26, 51, Dinder and Rahad provide, to our best understanding and assessment, about 3 for Dinder and 1 for Rahad over the period of the 100 years I talked about. And the Kazmel Jirba contributes, or the Atbara contributes another 11 billion cubic meters. These are the plants, the reservoirs, and also the hydropower facilities that we have modeled carefully. So we model these features. Of course, includes the GRD, the Rosario Sanal, Kazmel Jirba, Meroe, High Aswan Dam, and the Old Aswan Dam. And so that's what I'm going to, the assessments that we're going to discuss and the impacts relate to these plants, relate to deficits, to hydrological, to flows, relate to power production, relate to reservoir levels, and whatever influences different scenarios of management might have on these plants and on the system as a whole. So the features that we model include, as I said, the typical hydraulic features of these dams, but also the flows and the routing dynamics of the river segments. Okay? So that includes, like I said, storage, versus elevation, tailwater, power production. Whenever we had turbine characteristic curves, we used those. Whenever we didn't, we used the general equations that were used by the agencies that are doing feasibility studies or whatever else. And the resolution, the time resolution of the system is 10 days. So all the stuff, all the analysis you will see come from simulations and optimization and assessments on a 10-day basis over the 100-year period that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to skip that. There's detailed data that I'll be happy to discuss with respect to evaporation, with respect to the information that we used in this system. Like I said, it was based on your information, on information from Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. About evaporation, one thing, of course, we need to note is that the GRD, in terms of the millimeters per year, experiences about 700, on average, millimeters per year evaporation from the surface of the reservoir. As we go down the river, this evaporation rate, as we know, increases in the Sudanese reservoirs as well as the High Aswan Dam, and it goes up to about almost 2,700 millimeters. So there is a climatic difference between where, the location of the GRD with the location of the others. And that plays an important role in this whole business of trying to understand how much water is available, that we need to work with. The river routing part, we also did for the first time here. Harst long ago talked about certain losses every 100 kilometers, but I decided that it's good to be a little more specific about how water moves through the system, because there are abstractions and then there's returns maybe and things like that. So we used a very detailed dynamic model which we have published recently that has interesting capabilities, and I invite you to read the publication I have here if you're interested in the technical aspects of how the routing model works. And so we try to model on a 10-day basis what comes in, what comes out, and how the river segments work. Because we want to be able to understand well how the flows in the river are going to change, the regime, the pattern, through different scenarios. So some calibration statistics are here. I'm happy with the errors comparing observation and simulation results. So we have gone through tedious analysis to make sure that we come as close as possible given the information we have on the observations. So for example, down at the bottom here there are two lines here. One is so this particular route in reach is the Khartoum, from Khartoum to Dongola, which is at the entrance of the High Aswan Dam. So this is the two lines here, one blue, one red, simulated and observed. And so you can see that the errors which are actually plotted down here in faint lines are pretty small. Only about, on average, the mean absolute error, not the mean error, the mean absolute error is approximately 12, which is a small amount of what the actual flow in the river is. So overall, I feel that the reliability of the models is good. That's the water demands plotted as a fraction of the annual over the 10-day periods of the year. And the red one is the irrigation demands in Egypt, and that have to be taken out from the High Aswan Dam through releases. And the blue and the faint is the upstream, the Sudanese irrigation demands. And as you see, there's a shift because the climate shifts. And so it's also good to understand that there's phase differences between downstream and upstream. But all of that stuff is encoded in the system. So here's the final system model for those of you that wish to know how it works. So the black correspond to the reservoirs, impoundments that is, and that's GRD, Rosiris, Sennar, Kasmel Jirba, Meroe, and the High Aswan Dam. Meroe is a small reservoir, but he has an important role to play, and as all of the dams in the Nile. And so we have explicitly modeled it as well. There's also smaller impoundments that are just around on the river. So those are included, but they don't really regulate the flow of the river. They don't have that capacity. And the blue segments correspond to routing reaches. You know, this dynamic routing reaches that I mentioned earlier. So the total system simulation and model includes all of these components. There's water balance for the reservoirs, accounting for evaporations, net evaporation actually, and inflows and power production and the rest of it, and releases. But then the system is connected through the network that we have indicated here, so that we can look at it in an integrated fashion. So let me tell you, that was the model. Like I said, I can talk more about it if you want for a long time, but let me focus on the assessments and what the findings are and what we have learned out of these assessments. Before I do that, I must tell you that the way that these things are presented here as an information. That is, my objective and our objective in this analysis was to try to understand what the trade-offs are and to search, to look at general features of filling rules and regulation rules for the GRD and cooperative rules that might make the system more resilient and more robust for all. So that's what the trade-off is. And I'll talk to you about it. That's my intention, to quantitatively pin down what the system will look like after the GRD will come online under different scenarios of demands and regulation policies. Now, what is appropriate is not our value judgment, it's yours, but so my role as an analyst stops there. My obligation is to give you the best technical information I can. Then you have to discuss it, figure out but I have a hopeful message in the end, because I do believe that that old man, Herodotus, he had a good idea. I'll tell you about it later. So, bear with me. And if you don't like something you see because you come from a certain country, bear with me, because at the end, we need to look at the holistic picture. So the first thing I'd like to say is that things have changed for Egypt. Once upon a time, there was a significant drought. That was 1980, and Egypt was the Hyason Dam had just been filled at the time, and Egypt was able to go through the drought without actually experiencing any shortages, any irrigation shortages, and that was a great thing. And the Hyason Dam really paid off that particular 10-year period. It was a very important period for Egypt, and the Hyason Dam construction helped Egypt to go through this without any losses and damages. Not going to happen anymore. Today, if the same drought happens, and that's because of the simulations we have done, whereby we said, let us assume the current conditions of demands and the current conditions of the abstractions and the current infrastructure in the system, and let's go through again this 100-year period to see what will happen. Well, if this were to happen again, because the demands have increased, Egypt is going to experience deficits. The Hyason Dam is not enough to actually, cover all the requirements that Egypt has and Sudan has. That's one thing. And here I have indicated what might happen if the same kind of drought were to take place. So there would be approximately 44 billion cubic meters in 4 years of deficits that will occur. If you consider that the total amount, annual amount for Egypt's irrigation requirements is about 55, you can see that this is a significant amount. There will be a reduction in the, certainly in the provision of water for water supply. And here is so this is the deficits, that's the Hyason Dam level, and this is the energy production. There will be periods here where the energy will have to, from the Hyason Dam, will have to shut down. The reason for that is that below a certain level, it's 159 meters actually at the Hyason Dam level, the turbines, the current turbines cannot operate. The ones that have been replaced, the original ones could work, but these ones cannot. So if the reservoir level falls below 159, then we have to shut down, the Egyptians have to shut down the turbines. So there will be an interruption of the power from the Hyason Dam, and this is what the interruption will look like. It will be 13 years. If I include all of the shutdown periods during the drought like this, you will have 13 years of no operation in the power facilities of the dam. That's a significant change from the past. The average energy generation, just for future comparisons, is approximately 7,000 gigawatt hours per year between the two, Hyason Dam and the old Aswan Dam. I'll tell you this because it's good to compare with what will happen when the GRD is online, both for the GRD production as well as the Egyptian production. Okay? Here in this little table, I have quickly put together the spreadsheet, so to speak, of the water balancing and accounting for this situation we are now. So without the GRD, of course there's no evaporation, the total inflows are approximately 90 billion cubic meters per year on average for the 100-year period I'm talking about. You know, if you cut and paste on a different period, you will have a different average. But for this period, it's approximately 90, okay? And the evaporation from the Rosiris and Nar Kazm Algebra and Meroe are approximately 2.46 billion cubic meters. I'm going to this detail because everything matters. In the end, the question is how much water is available to meet what objectives. So we need to try to talk about this. The Hyason Dam evaporation is 10, or almost 11 billion cubic meters because of the high evaporation rate at the down below where Egypt is. The Tosca spills are small, 0.3. River reaches, you know, there's losses in the river reaches as the water goes through and flows through the system, and that's what this river routing model that we developed does. Not only produces the flows, but also assesses what the river reaches losses are. So there's 3.445 billion cubic meters of losses in the river channels. So the total losses in the system, I'm counting the evaporation losses in all the dams and also in the river, are approximately 17 billion cubic meters. Just to get us sort of a sense of magnitudes of losses, abstractions, and the like. The Sudan water use is taken to be 18.5, and the Egyptian water use is taken to be 55. So if you, under this scenario, and given the deficits that we have, everything balances. That is, the total yield is approximately equal to whatever is used and is released from the system that we have defined. Okay? So I'm telling you all that because we need to compare later on. So let me see here. So I'll try to tell you some of the findings that we have, and also support them through some of the graphs and information that we have developed using this model. So one thing for sure is that, I mean, if you ask anybody in the world, what do you know about the Nile, they will tell you, oh, the Nile, it's the floods that come and go. And that's the signature of the river, right? And, well, no more. If the GRD comes online, because the dam has a significant storage of about 60 or 59 billion cubic meters, if you were to go to be filled at the top capacity of active storage, and the Blue Nile average flow at that location is 51, as I mentioned, that regulation capability can even out the flow of the river. So here's what will happen down here. I have two lines. One is the current conditions, or without the GRD. That's the red line that goes up and down and shows the flooding that happens every year. And then the blue line is the line that actually is the flow at the, let's see, where's that? At the Ethiopian-Sudanese border after the dam that will materialize if we were to, if the GRD were fully operational. So you see a lot of these reds up and downs go away, because we have the capacity in the GRD reservoir to actually to keep the flow and release it accordingly to whatever the release policy is. And so you see here for many, many years, this blue line is actually constant. That corresponds to how much flow is required to meet the Ethiopian power requirements. Sometimes when we have severe droughts, the reservoir hits the bottom of the buffer zone, and therefore we have deficits in terms of that particular flow. We cannot meet that flow. The Ethiopians cannot meet that target for power production. And sometimes when we have severe high floods, you depart from this blue line, which is constant, and you have the typical pattern of the floods going up and down. So that's what will happen if the GRD were to be in place and to be operated according to the Ethiopian sort of interest for meeting the targets of power production 10 day by 10 day through the 100 years. This is the power production here that would be produced from this large dam on average. It's a frequency curve, this one. That is, I have taken the power production on a 10 day by 10 day basis for the 100 years, and I converted it into a frequency curve. The highest one goes first up here, and with small probability, and as you go down, you go to the more average, and then we have the droughts that actually drop down the frequency curve, to zero. So as you see here, the average power production is quite significant. It's twice that of the highest on dam, oldest one dam complex. It's about 14,000 gigawatt hours per year. And that is reliable 90% of the time, which is up to here. So significant. This power production project, I mean, in terms of energy production for Ethiopia, this project is it's a very important project. I mean, it produces, and in comparison to every other hydropower facility, it's actually quite an important project and producing reliable energy, not only for Ethiopia, I suppose, but for the whole region. One thing I want to mention here is that please notice that it is only about 90% of the time that the reservoir cannot actually meet the requirements for Ethiopia. I mean, 10% of the time they cannot meet Ethiopia, and these correspond to the drought periods of the Nile system. Okay, and so the rest of the time it actually can handle it, and it can actually do many more things because it's a large reservoir. But 10% of the time is when we have stresses where the real droughts occur. So let me talk a little bit about the filling strategy, which is it is a concern, because you see, if you're going to to take water out of the river to fill 60 billion or more cubic meters of storage, clearly that 60 billion will have to come out from the overall river flow, and therefore it will affect, it will transfer virtually some of the storage that would otherwise go to other storage facilities in the system upstream to the GRD. So there's going to be some impact. The question is, what is that impact? And also, is there a way to try to mitigate it and minimize it to the extent possible? That's the intention of what we're doing here. So here's the finding is that if the filling that we're talking about follows the 6-year fixed rule, which is what initially was proposed, I think, the feasibility studies of the GRD, there is a potential that Egypt is going to experience water impacts which are severe and serious if that 6-year period happens to coincide with a drought period, like the 1980s. And here's what will happen if that were to be the case. The red line is the 1980s drought. I'm starting here 1980 and I go to 2011. So that's a 30-year period that I'm simulating. So the red line corresponds to the case without the GRD, the current conditions, which I told you are going to cause deficits in Egypt anyway. And this is the highest dam level. The blue line is what will happen if we put in the GRD at 1980, that is, hydrologically we put it at 1980, and then we go through the system and we follow the 6-year rule of taking water out according to the plan that the dam was at the feasibility stage, I suppose, initially proposed to fill. So clearly here, you see that the highest dam level is going to be lower under these circumstances, and it's actually going to bottom out a little more than what would have happened if the GRD was not there. But we're expecting that, right? The deficits in Egypt were going to increase from what would have been without the GRD to almost double. So it would be about 40 without the GRD. That's the red line over here. The blue line happens earlier, and there are deficits for Egypt to the tune of about 75 billion cubic meters. So it's going to last 6 years, and if the drought were to coincide with the filling period, and the deficit would be more significant. And power production at highest dam would also be impacted, as you expect. And the blue line is shifted to the left of the red line. The red line is what will happen without the GRD. The blue line is with the GRD, operating to meet Ethiopian, or to meet the filling rule, actually, and power production according to the filling period. And there will be approximately, let's say, 50% increase in the years that the highest dam turbines cannot function because the level is below 159. And the power production would go from about 54 to 35. So there is a reduction there. In terms of the water balance in the different reaches that I told you earlier, that's what will happen here. Let's see, the evaporation of GRD would actually happen now, and while it was 0 before, now it's 1.4 billion per year. The evaporation in the Sudanese reservoirs is also going to go up because, of course, the flow is more uniform. Therefore, the Sudanese would have the benefit to try to keep the reservoirs high to maximize their power production. That's how this particular simulation was coded. And the evaporation of the highest dam will go down because now we have a reservoir which is lower. And remember that there's an intense evaporation rate at the highest dam. So there's a gain, so to speak, quote unquote, in the highest dam in terms of evaporation, but there is a transfer of that evaporation losses to the other reservoirs that are now in the system. And Sudan has no shortages. Sudan, under this scenario, and under any scenario that I will show you, is immune to droughts. So that's a benefit for Sudan. There's no doubt about it. But the operation of the Sudanese system is a key element to what will happen, how much water can actually arrive in Egypt or not. So that's why Sudan is a key partner in this whole discussion. It's not about Ethiopia and Egypt. It's also, and very importantly, Sudan in these discussions and the trade-offs. So that's the assessment of the initially proposed filling rule. So we thought, because our intention was not to try to see, is there any other rules that exist out there that we can actually mitigate some of these impacts? Because some of them are significant if they coincide with a drought. I repeat that again. So this is one of the, actually we tried multiple rules to try to figure out what the trade-offs are. And this is one type of rules, that we tested. And this one in particular says that let's tie the filling of the dam to the yield of the Nile for that year. And this particular rule says don't do anything until this reaches 75 billion cubic meters total. Remember, the annual yield of the Nile is 90 in this particular period, depending on the period. But let's say here we don't use the water to fill the dam, and then we start filling. And we fill at the rate of approximately, this is what this line shifts, and then we continue this way, which means that we can take some of the water once the flow is higher than 75. That's one rule. You can play around with those parameters as you wish, and we have. And so this the dust red rule is about 85. So we go to 85 billion cubic meters before we can actually start the filling of the reservoir. Just out of curiosity to see what will happen if we were to follow these rules. The key thing here is to try to not just have a prefixed and predetermined way of filling the reservoir, but actually tie it into something to the river. And the idea is to try to use the years, or to use the flows that are in excess of the mean, so that hopefully that can mitigate the impacts to the downstream nations. So let me show you some of these results to see how sensitive the dam, the Hyason Dam, and also the deficits are to these rules. They are sensitive to those things, and this is where the trade-offs come in. I mean, it's good to try to do a whole range of those things and then figure out in the end what makes sense in terms of filling this reservoir. So this is the GRD. This is the red rule. The red rule was what was it? Let's look at it again. The red rule was to wait until 85 and then is that right? No, here is this. The red rule is the 75 billion cubic meters, so somebody switched the colors on me. But anyway, this is the red lines correspond to the 75 billion cubic meter rule. We wait until the total flow of the river, that is the White Nile, Didn Rahat, Blue Nile, and Atbara, exceed 75, and then we begin to fill the reservoir with the excess flow above 75, up to a certain level. And so you see here, this rule takes approximately, let's say, in this particular case, from 1930s, okay, takes approximately 5 years or something to fill the reservoir. So depending on the flows that you have, you can actually go faster than the 6-year rule, or slower, depending on what the drought circumstances are. The 85 rule is a little slower to fill, as you expect, because we don't do anything until 85, and then we begin to fill. And so this one takes a little longer. It takes, I don't know, 8-9 years. But the effect on the downstream system also is different. So the green line here corresponds to the case, the baseline scenario, where we do not have the GRD in place, okay? And that's the highest Hyason Dam level line. And then the blue line, which is the slower of the two, causes a drawdown in the Hyason Dam. But the drawdown, one could say that it's manageable, from the green line to the blue line. It's up to how people see these things and how they judge the benefits and costs. And the red line, which is the one that actually takes more aggressively water out of the river when the river exceeds 75, causes the Hyason Dam drawdown to be more serious. And so from the green line, you go down to this. I showed you this because I want to demonstrate that there is a sensitivity in the way that the impacts are going to occur downstream, depending on the rules that we apply and depending on the hydrological circumstances of the river. So that's what will happen here. Now, we've done this not only for the 1930s, but also for all the decades in the system, and many, many different rules. So quickly, I'll go through those. This would be the 1970s, where the flows were a little less. And as you see here, the differences in this curve change. It's not just a proportional thing, depends on the flows. And how the thresholds I have set, 75 and 85, impact the actual circumstances. And many others. The 90s, 80s is the worst, of course, because it was the worst drought. And as you see here, it would take longer to fill the reservoir, and it would have the impacts that you see here. Let me summarize quickly on this and say that having done it for the whole of the period, every 10 years, we see that the 75 billion cubic meters rule would actually lead to about 3.8 to 15 years for filling the GRD. Okay, the average is 7.1 years over this period. The 85 rule will take a little longer, from 6.5 to 27 years to fill it up completely, okay? And the average will be 13 years. So there is, if you were to look into the hydrological circumstances and tie the filling rules to those, that fixed kind of rule may actually be exceeded in performance, but also may not be because of the drought circumstances. The highest on dam impacts of these different rules are also different, and the 75 billion cubic meter rule causes a drawdown of about 10 to 15 meters from the baseline condition, and the 85 rule causes 3 to 5 meters. Those are also different. So of course there's everything in between that you can think of, because I could say 80 as opposed to 85 or 75. I could say 60, and there's a whole array of different rules that one can think of. But there's a sensitivity to this. As far as the energy production again goes, we have also assessed that, and there's a reduction on the 75 rule. There's a reduction of 11 to 14% from the baseline, and the 85 has a 5.9 to 8. So the 85 BCM rule, of course, which is closer to the annual yield of the Nile, which was 90 for the period that I told you about, causes less impacts. Okay, so there is a point to consider to tie the filling rule to what the actual flow conditions in the system are. Now, let me summarize about the filling rules and then move on to something else which is also very important. So our sense from the analysis we've done is that the GRD filling rule can have significant impacts on Egypt depending on when you actually take and you fill the reservoir. The fixed 6-year rule that was initially proposed can increase the Egyptian irrigation deficits, cause highest level drawdowns, and reduce energy generation. And I have told you quantitatively what these are. If, that's a big if, and that's an important if the filling coincides with a series of below normal flows. Okay? If it happens to be in years where the flows are good, then of course those adverse impacts are mitigated. Rules that link the GRD filling to annual river yield can mitigate adverse impacts. That's my main point here. And they are worth considering, I think, if they have not been considered in your analysis. We have tested, in fact, the way that we have developed our system was to facilitate this kind of analysis for many different options. Like I said, it's not about finding an optimal one, because we're not the ones to judge. But it's about looking at an array of possibilities and seeing eventually through the tri-state, tri-nation negotiation process and dialogue to figure out what is best. So we tried different rules, lines, sort of coordination with the storage, with the downstream storage, that is to try to relate how much water is taken in the GRD based on the highest on dam storage in addition to the yield and other things. So one can think of many things to try and mitigate the impacts, and there are ways to do that, but the main thing, the key element is to perhaps consider tying the obstructions and the filling of the dam to the flows of the river. All right, that's the filling. How about the long-term impacts on the system if the GRD were to be online and operated according to certain policies? The policy from EPCO, which was again the policy proposed when the dam was analyzed at first, is to consider what to do, to consider releases that actually keep track of what the firm energy generation, I mean, to maximize the firm energy generation for Ethiopia. The firm energy generation, if you are familiar, is the amount of energy that is reliable year after year, month after month, throughout the period. So you have an option there, because you can actually increase that firm energy, but then you're not going to have it for the same reliability. If you decrease it a bit, then the reliability increases. So there's a little bit of a song and dance between the reliability and the magnitude. But I think the idea of the originally proposed, which is a good idea for Ethiopia, if the dam is really meant for power production primarily. But let's assess it and see what happens not only for Ethiopia, but also for the downstream nations. And then I have considered a bunch of other alternative regulation rules, which I will call coordinated rules, because they are not only considering the operation of the GRD with respect to the Ethiopian interest, but they try also to see if somehow the reservoir can also provide some relief for the downstream nations to mitigate some of the impacts that potentially can occur, if they occur. It may be in a real ideal situation that this particular policy, the one proposed by Ethiopia, does well with respect to everybody. That's something to be determined. So the alternative regulation policies that we consider here are to actually do what Ethiopia wants for as long as the flow of the river is enough to also meet the downstream interests. When the flow of the river, in that 10% of the time, because that's essential, you see, nothing is clear-cut and black and white in the world of water resources. If I can make the statement that 90% of the time Ethiopia and the GRD project actually operates to meet the interests of Ethiopia. And that's a big statement. The 10% is what I'm concerned about, because the 10% is the one that's going to cause the damages or the impacts to the downstream nations. So we need to consider, we need to go down a bit, not just stay at the surface about what each one of these rules says, but what it really means, and for each one of the partners in this. So what we have done here is to say, let us also consider rules whereby Ethiopia operates as they please and for national interests only when the reservoir is up to the 2/3 of its storage. If it is up to the 2/3, which indicates that the flow in the river is wet normal or moderately below normal, then let's leave it like that. But then when the storage begins to drop below the 1/3, dips into the 1/3, then let us also consider cases where there is some operation that actually provides relief for Egypt and Sudan as well, and see what kind of impacts this will bring. So these are the kinds of rules and policies that we have developed here. There are other things we can do, and again, if we had another 5 years, I would have done a nice forecasting system that actually forecasts the flows and keeps everybody's interests as maximum as possible. But that's something for the future, I think, because adaptive management is something that you're going to have to consider eventually. But these are the types of rules that I'm going to show you here. So we tried different things, and so we have the baseline. I'll show you results of that. We'll try the A2 scenario is the one that optimizes and the Ethiopian interest without doing much for without intentionally supporting downstream requirements. The A1 is no GRD, so that we can compare is the baseline. The A2 is the Ethiopian policy, let's say. And the A3 to A6 are policies where we have coordination with some kind of storage. Either zero storage, which is an option, or up to about 30 BCM out of the 60 in the system. To see, is it possible, does the coordination entail and accrue any benefits to the downstream countries and mitigates the impacts? And then another set, actually just showing here, depending on what is the total abstraction and the water use in Sudan. So this is for 18.5, this is for 17.2. We have done also 16 and others. So because they're different parameters, and that is the whole thing I was telling you about running what-if scenarios and figuring out what they mean, what the trade-offs are. That's how we generate the trade-offs. So the assessment criteria, there are many, and they have to do with reservoir responses, levels and reservoir evaporation losses, river flow hydrographs for flooding or prevention of flooding, and energy generation, both at the GRD and the High Aswan Dam, and whether we see any differences, and finally water supply deficits in the two countries. I think Hessam wants me to complete. So Okay, I think you know that. But here, I want to show you that, let me just emphasize the bullets. So, Egypt is vulnerable to severe droughts at present conditions without the GRD. We have talked about that. As Sudan's requirements begin to approach 18.5, if you get to that point, given the additional losses that happen in the system, then the whole system goes into stress, because eventually the targets that we have actually exceed the amount of water available. If GRD, I'm saying here, is operated to support Ethiopian hydropower interests only, this is the non-coordinated operation, Egypt's vulnerability to severe droughts will increase, it turns out. Because during the droughts, Egypt is, because of the losses that are happening, the evaporation and the river reaches and stuff, Egypt cannot actually meet the irrigation deficits. In Sudan, always meets the requirements that it has, and therefore it is immune to droughts, just by the mere fact that GRD is there and actually generates flows that are more uniform for the system. And I have here the particulars as to what the quantitative differences these are. So that's basically what happens. In terms of energy generation, the energy generation in Egypt is going to decrease if Ethiopia focuses on meeting only the Ethiopian requirements, while Sudan's will increase because the reservoir levels in Sudan don't have to, like in Osiris and Sennar, do not have to go to have these wide swings that follow the flood of the Nile, because it's now, so the head of on the turbines on the Sudanese reservoirs is going to increase more consistently, and there's more power production. And again, there is quantitative information about this. But here is the coordinated rule that I think has some interest in terms of compromising and meeting everybody's requirements to a good extent. So here is this rule that we tested, which is, this is the coordinated policy, which says, if GRD is regulated, 1, to maximize the Ethiopian hydropower interests during wet, normal, and moderately dry years, and B, provide relief to Egypt during severe droughts, that 10%, 15% that I told you about, and the Sudanese targets actually for water do not actually, they are kept within 16 billion cubic meters so that we can balance out the losses. There's some agreements, and I don't want to refer to these agreements, but there are terms that actually say how these things are going to be shared between the countries, not only the benefits, but also the losses. That's not a bad idea. I'm not sure if the actual numbers are appropriate, but it's not a bad idea to share benefits as well as losses. That's a principle that I think we should follow. So under a rule like this, what happens is, in the system, Ethiopia's hydropower interests are practically met as originally intended. That is, if I compare to you, with you, the firm energy generation that the GRD produces for Ethiopia in the two cases, they're not very different at all. They're the same, essentially. Egypt and Sudan, the benefits for Egypt and Sudan in that scenario would be that they actually have a relief during droughts, and therefore they don't experience these heavy shortages that they would have experienced if the GRD were not in place. So you see, there is GRD can be a benefit, can be an opportunity for all of the Nile Basin countries involved here, if only we actually tweak a little bit the filling and the regulation of that system to actually be coordinated and be cooperative in a regional sense. So this is my summary of it all. A regionally sustainable master plan that accrues benefits to Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt exists. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. A good plan that actually can all around provide benefits to all exists, is there. It just needs to be formulated, it needs to be fine-tuned to sort of satisfy your own expectations. Let's call this the Eastern Nile Management Plan. It should be based, I think. There are some essential principles, trilateral principles that this plan should be based. And I'm suggesting here that, first of all, that the operation should be coordinated with downstream storage projects to mitigate water storage in Egypt, as well as to serve Ethiopian hydropower interests. I don't think that, I think that's possible to do this, although you need some good technical people to help and support this information. Net evaporation losses have increased. They will increase further under the GRD. Because of this, those thresholds and those shares, if we call them that, that the 1959 agreement actually set for Egypt and Sudan are not sustainable anymore. you cannot actually meet those kind of irrigation targets if, because of the increase of the evaporation in the different parts of the river and also the GRD. The excess, on average, about 4 to 5 billion cubic meters per year. So we have to find a way to sort of make this difference go away, or reconsider this whole thing so that we balance the flow in the river with whatever is used. The Eastern Nile plan should have detailed provisions for equitable water share reduction during severe droughts. I have seen this to be the case in many of the places that I have worked, in California, everywhere. No matter how much water the river has, no matter how many participants have to share the benefits. So it's not only about saying averages. We really need to have a detailed plan during droughts. It's that 10% that's going to hurt us the most. So the 90% of the time, nobody has a problem. Everybody's happy because everybody gets what they need. So we need to have a plan that is detailed and spells out how these reductions, how we're going to share the pain, so to speak. It's not only about sharing the benefits, like I said, it's also sharing the pain. How are we going to do this? How are we going to stand down some of the abstractions and the requirements to make, to make sure that we don't break the bank, we don't break the system for anybody. And of course, there has to be, as you know, and I know you're working on that, a regional cooperative management process, some sort of a commission, some sort of an agreement of how these things should be implemented. And I must tell you that I'm a big proponent of using advanced decision support tools that actually forecast the flows and make decisions not just based on a manual, but actually looking at the circumstances of the climate, of the current climate. Because no drought is the same as before. You're not going to have the same drought. So it's good to actually assess what's coming over the next season, figure out what, and then update. That's how California works. That is also a water scarce area, and we have worked with the California agencies to do that. That's what they do. In January, they predict the flows, then they figure out, look, we don't have enough water. Everybody's going to have to compromise. And then we proceed in February and March and until June, when the climate actually produces what it's supposed to produce, that's when the final deliveries are given. So the last thing I want to say here, which is also a very important thing, that we are not looking yet, and I'm very concerned about that. If I'm concerned about something, it's not about I believe you can find a nice policy that everybody can agree on. What I'm concerned about is that you're not looking at what the climate will do in the future. And I believe that we should have an effort to actually do this. And very quickly, let me tell you something. Here, I have done an analysis here. We're trying to do this because it's a detailed effort, but I can show you later on, if you ask me a question at the question session, why it is important to do this. Because there's signatures, there's evidence in the data, in the observed data, not in the models, in the projections, but in the observed data, that the climate is warming up, and in the long term, the flows are going to be reduced a little bit. And I can show you these results for the Blue Nile Basin as well as the Lake Victoria Basin. So to make sure that whatever plan we make is robust and resilient against climate change and meets your expectations for many years to come, we need to do an extra step. We need to not just consider the historical flows, but actually consider what happens in the future carefully. That's also an artful way to do this, and to make sure that the system is robust. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I will let you ponder what this great American president actually said and how it applies to the House of the Nile.